And actually, in the end, we do sometimes end up touching on those as well. Certainly, lots of Jewish writers, that diaspora is wide and far, but I really like to try to ground it in authors who have experience in those particular places. It's not a history of the Middle East. I'm not a historian. It's not an exploration of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian religions and their doctrines. Again, that's not my area of expertise. And nor is it a critique of Middle Eastern politics. Again, I'm a literature professor, right? So these are not my areas of expertise. I always say, though, that nevertheless, we have to recognize that literature is not written in a vacuum, ever, right? An author has their own experiences, they're writing in a certain time and place, and that, of course, informs the way that they tell stories. So I think I said last week, literary scholars always know just enough to be dangerous about things related to all of the things on this slide, because we have to know something about those things in order to better understand the stories. I think it's important for us to think about what it means to study global literature, to study literature that is beyond our own United States of America experience. And so we do some thinking about what do we mean by global. Universities used to refer to global literature as non-Western. And you can hear the bias of that, right? That it privileges Western, right, as being the thing, and then everything else is not that. And so we've shifted to calling it things like global in order to make that feel more inclusive and less sort of us and them. We always have to think about how we talk about and confront difference, and think about sort of who is the other, and how are we going to approach that difference and the other with empathy and compassion, and a genuine curiosity, right? We don't really know their experiences, and so we need to be open and sort of reserve judgment and bias. And as you read literature, right, particularly literature that's written in a different place or a different time, even in American literature, when you think about Huck Finn, for example, right, lots of controversy about the language that's used in that book, right? And we should pay attention to that. We should also recognize that it was written in a particular time and place when people thought differently about things, right? And so same when you're reading literature from a completely different, a place that feels completely different to you. We can only read these texts in translation, right? I don't read Hebrew or Arabic, and certainly my students don't either. And so we are always reading in translation, and certainly things are lost in translation, right? Idioms, for example, right? Metaphors that are unfamiliar. So we always have to keep those things in mind. There are purists who say we should never read anything in translation. I disagree, because how will we have exposure to it if we can only read it in the original? And I think the exposure is more important than sort of what you lose in translation. We always have to think about the demographics of our class. I teach at Augustana University, which is a predominantly white institution, right? But we have lots of international students, and certainly students of color as well. I always feel like it really enriches the course when we have students who have those different experiences. When I taught this course 3 years ago, I had a Palestinian exchange student in my course. She was at Augustana for just that one semester, And it was such a gift to have her there because she could provide a lot of context if she chose to. I try really hard when I have students in my class of not saying, you speak for all Palestinians, you speak for all African Americans, right? So there's a balance there. But it was so useful to have her in that class, and she was so willing to share. And it was also a great opportunity for me to hear, like, how am I presenting this? Does it feel accurate and true to your experience? The other thing that happened from having that student in that class was she told me at the end of the semester that she had never read anything written by a Jewish writer, and that she appreciated having that perspective as well. That was a great thing, I thought. Last semester, I had a student who was an international student from Ghana, and I had another international student from India in this course, and they were able to provide some context and experience for what it is to live in occupation. Not having had that experience directly themselves, but living in a country where that is part of their story. Right, occupation, British occupation in particular, and Palestine has that same story. They were under British occupation for years as well. So it was really fascinating to have their point of view on that as well. I will tell you that next week I'll have 2 or 3 students along with me who were in my class last semester. And that I'm super excited for you to hear their experience and their perspective of what taking that class was like. And along with that, right, what do we do with our own experiences, perceptions, assumptions, and biases? We come to these topics with all of those things. We come to anything with all of these things, right? And I certainly don't ask students to check those things at the door. That's impossible. They're so ingrained, but we do need to be aware of them, right, when we're talking about these things. So that's kind of the framing that I use for this course. I think I'm going to skip that slide in the interest of time. But this is interesting. This is Ian Barnard writing an article called The Difficulties of Teaching Non-Western Literature in the United States. And he says, U.S. mythology about individualism includes an implicit belief in the effectiveness and unlimited potential of individual agency and an understanding of conflict as struggle between individuals rather than as a product of history and material power relations. And I think to wrestle with that sort of goes along with our own assumptions and biases, right? That we are living in a culture where struggle is often man against man, right? Individual against individual. And the situation in Israel and Palestine is bigger. It's about power relations. It's about history that I don't know as Americans we can fully understand. So, and yet, even with all of these things, I ask my students, isn't there still value in studying the literature of another place and people? I think yes, right? I think yes, and I think they come to think that as well. So let's dive into some of that poetry, and I always start with poetry. I love it, for one, and then there's just something about it. And I always start the class with these 2 particular poets. Esther Rab is an Israeli poet, and you see her life range there. And then I couple her with Palestinian poet Fadwa Tukan, and you can see that they overlap in time a bit. Esther Rab is considered the first female Hebrew poet writing out of Israel. And they have some interesting overlapping history. And Fadwa Tuqan is also a preeminent female poet coming out of Palestine. What's interesting, I think, about looking at female poets is that the two cultures represented by Israel and Palestine are fairly patriarchal cultures, and so the women in these cultures have some similarities in terms of their freedom to express themselves, which I think is interesting for poetry as well. Just to give you a couple more lenses, the land and the history of Israel and Palestine, and then I also study trauma theory, and so I often read literature from that lens as well, both historical and personal, intergenerational trauma, those kinds of things. I won't get too far in the weeds on that because that'll take me in a whole different direction. This print is really tiny on this slide, I apologize. I just want to give us a few kind of touch points historically, right? So in 1917, we had the Balfour Declaration, which was a public statement issued during World War I by the British Foreign Secretary announcing support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Okay, so that's where that began. Then, shortly after the end of World War II, a declaration of the State of Israel came on the backs of what the Palestinians called El Nakba, or the catastrophe. And so at the same time, like 236,000 Jewish people immigrated to Israel, and 750,000 Palestinians were forced out of Palestine, for at least the part that is now Israel. And some of them left completely, thus the Palestinian diaspora. And then 1949, there's an armistice agreement, and what the famous green line is drawn to mark the boundaries between Israel and neighboring Arab lands, right? So, and it like literally a green marker on a map, just kind of following in some ways the topography of the land, like, well, this looks like a good place to draw a line, right? With I think, as I understand it, not a whole lot of thought. And then 1967, there was a 6-day war between Israel and Arab nations, which resulted in Israeli occupation of what we now call the West Bank. And as I said last week, it's called it's east of what's now Israel, but it's the West Bank because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River. And then first Palestinian Intifada from 1987 to 1991, and then the construction of the border wall beginning in about 2003.
What's the Intifada?
That's a Palestinian uprising against occupation. So when we look at these two poets, Esther Rab and Fadwa Tuqan together, I like to frame it with Jose Ortega y Gasset. He says, "Tell me the landscape in which you live, and I will tell you who you are." I don't know if any of you have encountered Kathleen Norris's book, Dakota, A Spiritual Geography. This is her whole premise, right? That where we live shapes our understanding of self and others and what community means and all those kinds of things. And Kathleen Norris is talking literally about the land itself, right, having that kind of effect. The fact that we can see for miles, for example, right, because of the flatness of where we live, informs sort of who we are. And same for others as well, right? So just a brief biography of these two women. Esther Rab's family founded a Jewish settlement called Petah Tikva in 1878. That tells you when her family arrived. in what is now called Israel. She's credited with being the first modern female poet in the land of Israel. And her goal is not to present the landscape, though she does, and we'll see that, but really what she's trying to get at is the emotion seething underneath the surface. And that word seething is interesting, and you'll see that in the poem I'm going to share with you in a minute here. Fadwa Tukan, on the other hand, describes Palestine as her lost homeland. She was born the year of the Balfour Declaration, so her personal history is deeply connected to the history. And she says that poetry, or the word, allowed her to travel outside the confines of kind of social expectations, particularly related to gender. So I think, yeah, let's go ahead and look at, sure. Let's look at these. I don't think I have enough, so you might have to get cozy with a neighbor. Maybe I'll send two down that way. You can share. I'll send two. Maybe you can share there. And let Judy has a few. So these two poems have to do with trees. And it's important to know that the pine tree is the national tree of Israel, and the olive tree is the national tree of Palestine. And they're writing about these particular trees. Poetry is meant to be heard, always. It's always meant to be heard. Because the sound is really important. And again, we're reading it in translation, so we're not getting the actual sound of these poems, but I trust translators to preserve as much of that as they can. So I will read these for you. So Pines of the Carmel by Esther Robb. All the green vigor of the chestnut trees in the Luxembourg gardens, all the clipped, combed groves of Versailles, I'd give up for you, pines of the Carmel. My green, slim brothers, rigid, twisted, tussle-crested, inured of the tempest and powerful winds from the sea. Hung upon nothingness, your crests sail between the sky and sea. Like cloaks of prophets rustling, flying, you all bow eastward, an assembly of abstinent saints. And thirsty, your roots grope and rip through to the marrow of the ancient earth, sowed with stone and covered in glory. At your feet is a rain-washed rock, like an altar wreathed with your fallen needles, your boughs, green candles bent from heat of their heart. Fume toward broad heaven, their pitch and the grayish green that melts. Pines of the mountains that sob in the wind, that rustle and speak of prophets and kings. Pines of the Carmel twisted and bowed, my pure, slim brothers. And then let's read Fadwa Tukan's The Deluge and the Tree. And you see that these poems are written, within 15 years of one another as well. The Deluge and the Tree. When the hurricane swirled and spread its deluge of dark evil onto the good green land, they gloated. The western skies reverberated with joyous accounts. The tree has fallen. The great trunk is smashed. The hurricane leaves no life in the tree. Had the tree really fallen? Never. not with our red streams flowing forever, not while the wine of our thorn limbs fed the thirsty roots, Arab roots alive, tunneling deep, deep into the land. When the tree rises up, the branches shall flourish green and fresh in the sun. The laughter of the tree shall leaf beneath the sun, and birds shall return. Undoubtedly, the birds shall return. The birds shall return. I'm going to open it up to you to tell me what you, or tell each other, what kinds of things do you notice in these poems? What's similar about their relationship with the land, for example? Where do you see some differences? Do you notice any similarities in the language these two poets are using to describe that relationship? What do you see? Oh, yes. The second one is more hopeful.
I think I had the feeling that the second one was more hopeful and the first one was a little depressing.
Can you say what you found more hopeful about that second one?
Well, the birds will return.
Yeah.
She was very firm about that, and things will be restored, is what I took that to mean.
Okay.
The first one, it was kind of sorrowful. I didn't see that things would be recaptured.
Okay. Thank you. Other thoughts? Other observations?
And I see things a little bit differently than Lynn. The first one seemed settled and strong and proud. And the second one seemed a little bit defiant, proud, but in a different way. I shall return, and sorrowful because I've been banished, but I shall return.
Okay.
The birds.
So you're hearing different tones. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think the first one is a lot more joyful and the second one is a lot more defiant. Yeah.
Interesting. Both of these poets spent time outside of Israel and Palestine. You see in Esther Rabb's poem, she's talking about the Luxembourg Gardens and those kinds of things. She did study in Paris. And Fadwa Tuqan studied at Oxford. So they each spent time outside of their homeland. So there's also sort of this interesting push and pull of I've been elsewhere, this is home. I wouldn't call that exile exactly, but certainly a leaving of their home. What do you think these poems are about? What they've gone through? Relationship between the land and the people. Do you see them having similar relationships, or does it feel different somehow?
Well, because they're both talking about trees,
Yeah.
which are, if not permanent, at least long-lived, and they both refer to the roots being in the ground and immovable. So yeah, it doesn't leave a lot of room for compromise.
Yeah. Yeah, very much about rootedness. Yeah. Esther Rabb says, and thirsty your roots grope and rip through to the marrow of the ancient earth. Right? And there's almost a desperation, right, in what she's talking about there. And Tuqan does the same sort of thing, right? Had the tree really fallen, she asks, never, not with our red streams flowing forever, not while the wine of our thorn limbs fed the thirsty roots, right? They both talk about thirsty roots. What does that suggest about their relationship? What is it to have thirsty roots?
I think a lot of that is reference to the climate and the environment, especially the climate.
Yeah, the arid desert, right? So that's kind of a literal reading of it, right? How these trees literally, what they literally have to do to survive. There is a thirst that is probably never fully quenched for things that are trying to grow. Is there a more metaphorical way of thinking about that?
Right, I think it refers to the deep-rooted feel that these women have for that land, that they feel planted deep there.
Yeah. Yeah, Jean's having a thought.
I'm coming.
Judy's getting her workout.
And they both talk about wind. And I just happened to read something this week that a tree does not grow strong if it's not in the wind. So the trials have strengthened both sides.
Yeah. Craig's got a thought back there.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, given your introduction, I mean, to me, the second one is this land being taken away from the long-term inhabitants, and but they're coming back.
Yeah.
I mean, that poem to me was very dark until the end.
Yeah.
And the other one is, you know, this joyous new land, and the trees from Versailles are just going to spread their beautiful roots there. And but there's some darker undertones in that one as well. But
So if you're reading that situation or that second poem is about the land being taken from them, who or what then is the hurricane? Establishing Israel. Yeah. The hurricane swirled and spread, right? And they gloated. The western skies, right, reverberated with joyous accounts. This sense of like the international community's reaction to this as opposed to those who were displaced, right, and their response. Yeah, and the birds, right? The birds shall return. It's interesting, too, I think, you know, Esther Robb, they both talk about sort of these, like a familial relationship with these trees, right? Esther Robb calls them her slim brothers. And Fadwa Tukan talks about, you know, Arab roots, the tree rises, the branches shall flourish green. But they are also the birds, right? The Palestinians are the birds in this poem who shall return. And that repetition at the end of that poem is really, I'm saying it, and I'm saying it again, and just in case you missed it, I'm going to say it a third time, right? Like, just this very, it's like in some ways like a protest cry, right? If you think about protest rallies, right? You're chanting and you're repeating things, and it has that kind of feel, yeah.
Tukan wrote this in 1967, Six-Day War. So it probably came after the Six-Day War.
That's right.
We're coming back.
We're coming back. Yeah. And many Palestinians who live in refugee camps in the West Bank, those camps, you know, have kind of a lot of them have sort of an arch or kind of a gateway into them. And what's displayed on many of those gateways is a key. And that key is representative of the key to the home they left in what is now Israel. We still have the key. We shall return. Yeah. Okay. Anything else about these two poems that you noticed or want to talk about? There's so much here. Craig.
So the first poem, the fourth line from the bottom, Pines of the Mountains. Pines of the mountains that sob in the wind. What do you think that's about, the sobbing in the wind?
What do you think that's about?
Well, I mean, to me, it was still a troubled land, you
Yeah.
know, and so it's not like it's ever been very peaceful over there
Yeah.
since the original granting of rights of this land to Israel.
Yeah.
So there's still some sobbing and gnashing of teeth. going
Yeah,
on.
still great. There's a lot of sorrow, it seems, in both of these poems. Sorrow, pride, anger. Right? We hear all these emotions. Christy.
Just to comment about the key in the Ida refugee camp is a key at the arch.
Yeah.
It did make it into the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest key in the world, if you think anyone's going to forget. But also at the end of the second one, the birds returning. I'm feeling that especially right now. Some of you know our friend Hanny out in Rapid City, who's from northern Gaza, and everything, the 300-year-old trees have been smashed. But the birds will return. Thank you. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other piece of that is, like, where do birds go if there are no trees? Right? And I think that is part of it too. One of the tragedies of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank is, in order to make room for those settlements, many, many olive trees are cut down, right? And that affects the economy of Palestine, but it's also like this, right? Like these trees represent who we are, and I forget, it takes years, decades, right? Maybe centuries to regrow an olive tree. It takes a really long time. Yeah.
You really don't destroy it. Even when it's down to nothing, it grows up from the roots again.
Yeah. That's beautiful too. Okay. Yeah.
I just have a comment about the second poem.
Yeah.
The first lines where it talks about they gloated.
Yeah.
The western skies reverberated with joyous accounts. The tree had fallen.
Yeah.
Is that referring to us?
Perhaps. Perhaps. I mean, I think just Western nations in general, right? You know, it was in some ways a UN decision, right, to create these two separate states. It comes out of that long occupation of Britain in that area, and then our connections to Israel. Yeah, I think absolutely. Okay. But also, west of Palestine is Israel, right? So there's that too. That's another way of thinking about that. Okay, are you ready for a couple more? What time do we end, Judy?
10:40.
Okay,
10:40.
ish. Okay. Yeah.
We stole.
So these are a little bit more recent poems. Also, you have a Palestinian poet, Mahmoud Darwish, and then a Hebrew poet. I do not. Yehuda Amichai. I didn't know how far we would get. So this is great. So Darwish, in his poem In Jerusalem, Darwish is a preeminent Palestinian poet. He was born near Galilee. The particular village in which he was born was razed by Israeli troops. He spent time in exile in around the Middle East and in Europe. He was imprisoned in 1960 for reading his poetry aloud without a permit. And this particular poem of his gained new significance in 2017 when then President Trump made the decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. So this poem went out, you would see it on social media and things as a response to that. One thing that you'll want to notice as we're reading it is that it makes references to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which is that's what Jerusalem is, right? I mean, it's the seat of all of those religions. So you'll see those references here. The translator, Fadi Judah, he's an American Palestinian who writes his own poetry as well. He has a really interesting poem called Palestine, Texas. Did you know that we have cities in the U.S. called Palestine, or Palestine, they're often called? So he does some interesting things with that, but I'd encourage you to take a look at that one too. So In Jerusalem by Mahmoud Darwish. In Jerusalem, and I mean within the ancient walls, I walk from one epoch to another without a memory to guide me. The prophets over there are sharing the history of the holy, ascending to heaven and returning less discouraged and melancholy because love and peace are holy and are coming to town. I was walking down a slope and thinking to myself, how do the narrators disagree over what light said about a stone? Is it from a dimly lit stone that wars flare up? I walk in my sleep. I stare in my sleep. I see no one behind me. I see no one ahead of me. All this light is for me. I walk. I become lighter. I fly. Then I become another, transfigured. Words sprout like grass from Isaiah's messenger mouth. If you don't believe, you won't be safe. I walk as if I were another, and my wound a white biblical rose, and my hands like two doves on the cross hovering and carrying the earth. I don't walk, I fly. I become another, transfigured. No place and no time. So who am I? I am no I in ascension's presence, but I think to myself, alone the Prophet Muhammad spoke classical Arabic. And then what? Then what? A woman soldier shouted, "Is that you again? Didn't I kill you?" I said, "You killed me, and I forgot, like you, to die." What do you see? What do you observe? I think the question in the center of this poem, how do the narrators disagree over what light said about a stone, is key. How do you understand that question? What is it asking, do you think?
I assume it's referring to the Dome of the Rock where Muhammad ascended into heaven, but maybe also the ascension of Jesus.
Yeah. the word narrators is about who's telling the story, right? Who has command of the story? Who gets to share the story? Whose perspective is the story told from, right? And that is the question here. Like, how do the storytellers disagree about this thing right here in the center of Jerusalem, the stone, and the light that came from it, right? And then he brings in all three faith traditions and their understanding of light, right? You see the allusions to Jesus, certainly. He names Muhammad, he names Isaiah, right? All those narrators and all those who have come after to tell the stories of those particular narrators, right? How do they disagree? Yeah. So it's I hear this poem as in some ways like a call to peace. And can't we get on the same page with what the story is and what we're about as people of faith, as people who live together in a particular place? This poem is very like ethereal, right? There's sort of like this imagination. I'm walking and I'm flying and I'm he's interacting with people of the past, right? These former prophets, right? And then we're snapped back into reality at the very end of this poem when he encounters the soldier who asks the question, right? And then what? Is the question prior to the soldier saying, "Is that you again?" Right? That translation of "and then what," it can also be translated as "and what now?" Right? And what now? Which is also a key question in this poem, right? Anything else you notice here? Yeah, Judy.
Just a thought I had is that the rock is there. It doesn't change, but everybody's perception of it changes. But it's there. It's the center of the story. And the truth is there. But everybody else has their own take on what the truth is. And it's like, maybe it doesn't matter.
Because it's right there.
The rock is there.
The rock is there. Yeah. The rock on which we stand, right? Christy's got a thought back here.
I think for me, a little perspective, when I talk every day, and I mean every day, to the people over there, that last line, and I forget like you to die, they don't talk about what's not right. They talk about, okay, this is what we're living with. How do you call this normal? What is a normal day? And that's always the focus. What do we do today? And I'm going to step out just a little bit because we have been discussing a lot of politics and how it comes together.
Yeah.
This week, a conversation with several pastors, it was brought up why the Muslim community would vote for a third party. Don't they know what they were doing? And it doesn't really matter which way you want to look at it, because in that statement, and this is the takeaway that we all had, to show how false our understanding of the other is, what they are saying is Muslims voted for a female Jewish for president. Now, if that doesn't blow every stereotype out of the water, I don't know what does, which is why I had to just share that little piece. We really don't understand or know.
Yeah.
But like you, we're not going to die today.
And even that little sort of almost parenthetical, like you, right, it seems to me to be this kind of reach across humanity, right? Even though in the poem, right, a woman soldier, so an armed soldier, is standing there with, you know, the speaker of the poem, presumably unarmed, right? There's still this effort to like you, right? We do have a shared humanity, and I also think the repetition of transfiguration in this poem is interesting in terms of, you know, in what ways are we transfigured by our situation, right? In what way is this poet or the speaker of the poem changed, right, because of an encounter? When we encounter the other, like you, we are necessarily changed. And if I learned nothing else from our brief time in Israel and Palestine, it was that when you sit across the table from somebody and share a meal or a cup of coffee or a Coke at 10:30 at night, you can no longer, what you see is, I am like you, right? You can no longer ignore the humanity. And I think that literature gives us a way to vicariously sit across the table and have a cup of coffee and have a better sense of somebody else's experience. And I think we're out of time, so I'll leave it there unless there are any other questions. What you have on the back side of this handout is a poem by Jewish author Yehuda Amichai. He's the most translated Hebrew poet since King David. And I chose this poem to pair with Jerusalem because he is also writing about a stone in a different kind of way. And so I'd invite you to, on your own time, read that. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or stick around if you want. I did bring a few books from my library on this subject, my literary library. So they're up here if anybody is just interested and wants to take a look. I really look forward to being with you next week. Like I said, I'll have 2 or 3 students with me, and we'll introduce you to some of the plays that we read for this class as well. So thanks.
I will also make a couple extra copies of this because I know we have people
great.
that are not in the same family that shared. So you might like to have that for your archives or whatever,
Yeah,
and I'll
great.
have them next week.
Great, thank you for joining me. Oh yeah, we have to turn that off before I turn this off, right?